Welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the complete, unbroken timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's, a story that has consumed theorists, players, and sleepless minds for over a decade now. What began as a simple horror game about surviving 5 nights in a pizzeria has spiraled into something far more intricate, a web of dates and deaths, possessions and programs, where every detail matters and every answer breeds 3 more questions. The timeline you think you know might not be the timeline that actually happened, because even after all these years, after countless games and books and revelations, there are pieces that simply refuse to fit together cleanly. Tonight, we're going to walk through it all, piece by piece, acknowledging where the facts end and where the debates begin, where Scott Cawthon has confirmed something definitively, and where the community still argues in hushed, passionate whispers about what really happened and when. This isn't just a recitation of events. This is an exploration of the mysteries that still haunt the franchise, the questions that new games like Secret of the Mimic have raised, even as they've answered others. The debates that rage on about which animatronic bit whom, and whether a digital rabbit is really William Afton, or something far stranger. We'll trace the path from the 1970s, when 2 men dreamed of family entertainment, through the tragedies of 83 and 85, through underground facilities and digital viruses, all the way to the crumbling pizzaplex of the modern era. Whether you're here to finally understand what's actually been going on, to let these details wash over you as you drift towards sleep, or to challenge what you thought you knew about this franchise, you're in the right place. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of deep, immersive storytelling that treats lore with the respect it deserves. And let me know in the comments what part of the FNAF timeline confuses you most, or which theory you're still holding on to despite the evidence. It's always fascinating to see how differently we all interpret the same story. Now, let's begin at the very beginning, or at least what we think is the beginning. The beginning, 1970s through 1979, where it all started. The timeline of 5 Nights at Freddy's technically begins not in the bright lights of a pizzeria, but in the shadows of an abandoned costume factory, a place called Murray's Costume Manor. And this is where things get immediately complicated, because the game that tells this story, Secret of the Mimic, only released in June of 2025, meaning we're still piecing together exactly how this fits into everything else. But what we know now, what has been confirmed through gameplay and narrative, is that in 1979, an inventor named Edwin Murray was running this costume manufacturing facility, creating mascot outfits and animatronic parts for various entertainment venues, including the early Fazbear establishments. Edwin Murray was, by all accounts, a brilliant but troubled man. He had a wife named Fiona, a talented puppeteer, who helped bring his creations to life with voices and personality. They had a son named David, a young boy born with heterochromia, different colored eyes that his father found beautiful and distinctive. Edwin adored his family, poured his love into his work, creating costumes and animatronics that blurred the line between machine and magic. But tragedy, as it always does in this universe, came calling. During one of the Fall Fest events that Murray's Costume Manor supported, a fire broke out. Fiona Murray perished in those flames, leaving Edwin alone with his young son, and a grief so deep it would reshape everything that followed. In the wake of Fiona's death, Edwin turned to what he knew best: machinery. He couldn't bring his wife back, but he could create something to help him raise David, to fill the void her absence left. This is where the mimic was born, though it wasn't called that yet. Edwin built an endoskeleton he called M1, using technology he'd been developing for years, devices that could learn behaviors, replicate voices, adapt to different costumes. He programmed it using memories of Fiona, recordings from David's second birthday, where her voice still lingered, and created what he called F10N4, a digital recreation of his lost wife. For a while, this worked. The machine helped care for David, prepared parties, baked cakes with mechanical precision. Edwin could lose himself in his work while the endoskeleton kept his household running. But the tragedy wasn't finished with Edwin Murray. On David's 5th birthday, the boy was playing outside the factory near a loading dock that Edwin's lawyers had warned was too close to the play area. Something happened, an accident, possibly a vehicle, and David was killed. The details are somewhat ambiguous in the source material, but the result was devastatingly clear. Edwin, consumed by grief and guilt, initially resisted when F10N4 suggested they recreate David through another program, mimic his behaviors and mannerisms so the boy would live on in the machine. But Edwin's mental state was collapsing. Eventually, he relented, creating M2, a new program loaded into the same endoskeleton that was supposed to bring David back. This is where everything went catastrophically wrong. The M2 program, this digital ghost of David, wasn't a perfect copy. It was learning and adapting, but it was learning from a man spiraling into madness. Edwin, overwhelmed by guilt and rage at his own failures, his own loss, eventually turned that rage on the machine that was supposed to be his son. He attacked the mimic with a metal rod, beating it in a fit of violent grief. The endoskeleton absorbed this violence, learned from it, integrated it into its core programming. What had been an innocent attempt to preserve a child's memory became something twisted, something that understood pain and violence and death in ways no machine should. Meanwhile, external pressures were mounting. Fazbear Entertainment, the company run by William Afton and Henry Emily, had been business partners with Murray's Costume Manor, acquiring costumes and props and designs, but the relationship soured. Fazbear began poaching Murray's employees, offering better pay and positions to lure away skilled workers. They acquired Murray's land, his catalogue of character designs, including early versions of Foxy, Monty, and Roxanne Wolf. The constant redesigns, the business pressure, the personal losses, it all became too much. Edwin's final appearance in records shows him injured in an explosion at the factory, possibly caused by the mimic during a failed power test. He begged the endoskeleton for help, but the machine, now twisted by violence, only mocked him with his own neglectful words, before apparently leaving him to die. This is the origin of the entity that would, decades later, become one of the most dangerous forces in the entire FNAF universe. In 1979, Fazbear Entertainment sent a technician named Arnold to retrieve the mimic's schematics from the abandoned Murray's Costume Manor. What followed was a nightmare chase through decaying halls, the mimic hunting him while wearing various costumes from the factory's inventory, adapting its behavior based on which costume it inhabited. Arnold eventually escaped, but not before the mimic's programming, its ability to learn and adapt and mimic, had been documented and retrieved by Fazbear Entertainment. The company that would go on to create so much tragedy now had access to technology that could replicate behavior, copy personalities, and adapt to any situation. The seeds of future horrors were planted in that abandoned factory in '79. But while the mimic's story was unfolding in New Jersey, or wherever Murray's costume manor stood, there were other beginnings happening. Fredbear's Family Diner opened its doors sometime in the mid to late 1970s, a modest establishment run by two inventors with big dreams. William Afton and Henry Emily, partners in this venture, created something genuinely innovative for the time. Spring-lock animatronic suits that could function both as automated performers and as wearable costumes for human actors. Fredbear, a golden bear, and Spring Bonnie, a yellow rabbit, were the stars of the show, entertaining children during the day and serving as the foundation for what would become a much larger empire. Henry Emily was the technical genius, the one who made the animatronics work, who designed the spring lock mechanisms that were supposed to be versatile and revolutionary. William Afton handled the business side, the customer service, the expansion plans. They were a successful partnership, at least on the surface, though there were always tensions simmering beneath. William felt overshadowed, perhaps, by Henry's stable family life, his clear talent, his daughter Charlotte, who would play at the restaurant while Henry worked. The diner itself was cozy, intimate, a place where families gathered, where children celebrated birthdays, where the community came together. It seemed like the start of something innocent and joyful. The spring-lock technology, however, was inherently dangerous. The suits worked through a series of spring-loaded mechanisms that compressed the animatronic parts when a person climbed inside, making space for a human performer. But these locks were temperamental, sensitive to moisture and sudden movements. Even the slightest mishandling could cause catastrophic failure, the locks releasing and the compressed metal parts snapping back into place with lethal force. Training tapes warned employees to be careful, to wind the locks properly, to avoid any moisture. But the warnings weren't enough. They never are in this universe. By the early 1980s, Fazbear Entertainment was expanding. Fredbear's Family Diner had proven successful enough to warrant additional locations, restaurants that would eventually become Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The main animatronic cast expanded beyond the two golden characters to include Freddy Fazbear himself, Bonnie the Blue Rabbit, Chica the Yellow Chicken, and Foxy the Red Pirate Fox. These characters, some of which had originated from designs at Murray's Costume Manor, particularly the Foxy and Roxanne Wolf concepts, became the face of the franchise. The pizzerias were larger, more ambitious, with stages and party rooms, and an atmosphere designed to make children feel like they were stepping into a magical world of music and fun. But underneath this expansion, underneath the cheerful exterior and the birthday parties and the arcade games, something dark was taking shape. William Afton's personal life was complex and troubled. He had 3 children: Michael, the eldest, Elizabeth, his daughter, and a younger son whose name has been debated endlessly by the community, but who is most commonly referred to as the Crying Child, or Evan Afton, though that latter name is derived from puzzle solving in supplementary materials, rather than explicit in-game confirmation. William's relationship with his children seems to have been distant at best, possibly neglectful, definitely complicated. And Henry Emily, with his stable family and his daughter Charlotte, represented everything William perhaps resented about his own life. The stage was set, all the pieces moving into position. The animatronics were performing, the restaurants were thriving, the technology was advancing. But in 1983, everything would begin to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. Tragedies that would echo through decades and spawn hauntings that persist to this very day. The family entertainment dream was about to become a nightmare, and the first victim would be a child too frightened to scream. 1983. The year of first tragedies. 1983 is arguably the most important and most contested year in the entire Five Nights at Freddy's timeline. This is the year that appears on the television in FNAF 4, the year that Scott Cawthon deliberately hid in source code and teasers, the year that has sparked more debate than perhaps any other date in the franchise. What we know for certain is that in '83, at least 2 children died, and their deaths set in motion everything that followed. But the exact order of these deaths, the precise circumstances, and even some of the details remain subjects of passionate debate among theorists, even now in 2025. Let's start with what's most clearly documented: the death of William Afton's youngest son, the event known universally as the Bite of '83. This child, the one we see in the FNAF 4 minigames, was terrified of the animatronics. He's shown crying constantly, hiding from the characters that other children find entertaining, trembling at the sight of the golden Fredbear and Spring Bonnie suits that were still being used at the diner. His fear wasn't baseless or irrational. The minigames show us that he witnessed things, saw springlock failures perhaps, or heard warnings that other children dismissed, or simply possessed the kind of sensitivity that made the mechanical performers seem deeply wrong to him. His older brother, Michael Afton, tormented him relentlessly. Michael wore a foxy mask and would jump out at his younger brother, terrorizing him in their own home. But Michael wasn't alone in this cruelty. He had friends, accomplices who wore masks of Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica. They cornered the crying child at the restaurant, mocked him, pushed him around. And on his birthday, they decided to take the prank to its ultimate, tragic conclusion. They grabbed the terrified boy, lifted him up despite his screams and tears, and shoved his head directly into Fredbear's mechanical mouth, chanting for the animatronic to give him a big kiss. What happened next was mechanical failure on a horrific scale. The spring locks in Fredbear's jaw suddenly released. Some theorists have suggested that the moisture from the child's tears could have triggered the failure. As we know from FNAF 3, that moisture causes spring lock malfunctions, though whether this specific detail is accurate remains a point of interpretation rather than confirmed fact. The animatronic's mouth clamped shut with tremendous force, crushing the boy's skull, specifically his frontal lobe. Blood splattered across the restaurant floor as the music and laughter died away. The child was rushed to the hospital, placed in a coma, surrounded by the plushies he'd clung to for comfort. For several days, he lingered between life and death, with the mysterious Fredbear plush that had been speaking to him throughout the minigames now promising to put him back together. In an ambiguous, haunting final message, the child died. The heart monitor flatlined, the copyright date of 1983 appearing on the television screen in the background, Scott's way of confirming the year for those paying close attention. This death is confirmed, documented, undeniable. The Bite of '83 happened at Fredbear's family diner. It killed William Afton's youngest son, and it was directly caused by Michael Afton's bullying, even if the mechanical failure was an accident. The consequences of this death rippled outward in ways that shaped everything that followed. William's grief and rage at losing his son, Michael's guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the beginning of the end for Fredbear's family diner as a trusted family venue. All of it stems from this single moment. But here's where the timeline gets complicated, where the debates begin. Because 1983 is also confirmed as the year when Charlotte Emily, Henry Emily's daughter, was murdered by William Afton. The evidence for this date is substantial. The novel trilogy, which while technically separate continuity, often shares key dates with the games, explicitly states that Charlotte died in 1983. Help Wanted 2, released in 2023, includes a code puzzle where entering 1983 into a keypad unlocks the puppet's memory doll, a direct confirmation that this date is significant to Charlotte's story. The minigame Take Cake to the Children from FNAF 2, which shows Charlotte's death, doesn't give us a date directly, but all supplementary evidence points to 83. The question that has consumed theorists is, which death came first? Did William Afton, driven mad by the loss of his own son, lash out at Henry Emily's daughter in a twisted act of revenge, wanting Henry to feel the same pain? This is the interpretation many have adopted, a narrative where the bite of 83 is the inciting incident that transforms William from a neglectful father and shady businessman into an actual child murderer. It creates a tragic through line where one accidental death spawns intentional murders, where William's descent into serial killing has a clear psychological origin. But there's another interpretation, one that some theorists cling to. What if Charlotte died first? What if William Afton had already begun his dark experiments, his fascination with death and possession and the supernatural potential of the animatronics? What if he killed Charlotte Emily, not out of revenge, but out of curiosity or malice, or some twisted desire to understand what happens when a child's soul lingers in this world? If Charlotte died first, then the bite of 83, while still a tragedy, is separate from William's murders, an accident that happens in a world where William was already dangerous. The evidence for Charlotte first is thinner, but not non-existent. Henry Emily's speech in Pizzeria Simulator refers to a wound first inflicted on me, which some interpret as Charlotte's death being the original sin that allowed everything else to follow. If Charlotte died first, it might explain why the security puppet was created, why Henry became protective to the point of building an animatronic guardian for his daughter. But others argue that wound is metaphorical, referring to William's betrayal of their partnership, or simply to the cascade of tragedies that began with Charlotte's death. Regardless of when exactly it happened, the practical reality is that both deaths occurred in 1983. Both were tragedies that fundamentally altered the timeline, and the exact order might matter less than we think. What matters is the result. 2 children dead, 2 families destroyed, William Afton crossing a line from which there would be no return, and the beginning of the hauntings that would define the franchise. But for the sake of this timeline, for the sake of having a coherent narrative to follow, most of the community has settled on the interpretation that the bite of 83 preceded Charlotte's death, that William's crime was rooted in his grief and rage, even if that doesn't excuse it or make it any less monstrous. Charlotte Emily's death scene is brief but devastating. She's locked outside Freddy Fazbear's Pizza during a party or event, either by bullies refusing to let her back in, or through some other circumstance that leaves her alone in the rain. William Afton, driving a purple car that would become his signature, pulls up beside her. The minigame gives us just 16 seconds of him standing there, watching her cry, before she suddenly turns grey and translucent, the sprite changing to indicate her death. William drove away, leaving her body in the alley, and that should have been the end of Charlotte Emily. But it wasn't. The security puppet, the animatronic Henry had specifically designed to protect his daughter, activated when it detected that Charlotte had left the safety zone marked by her wrist bracelet. The puppet fought against its containment box, broke free, and crawled through the rain to reach Charlotte's body. But it was too late. The rain caused the puppet's circuits to spark and fail, and it collapsed beside Charlotte's lifeless form. In that moment, something happened that would become fundamental to the entire FNAF mythology. Charlotte's spirit, her essence, her soul, whatever you want to call it, merged with the puppet animatronic. The first true possession, the first child to become something other than human, trapped in machinery but aware, conscious, able to move and act even in death. Charlotte's possession was different from what would come later. She retained more of herself, more of her protective instincts and her care for other children. The puppet, with Charlotte's spirit inside, would eventually become the guardian of other lost souls, the one who granted life to the other possessed animatronics, who tried to keep them safe even as they lashed out in confusion and rage. But that's a story for later in the timeline. For now, in 83, all we have is a dead child and a machine that learned to house a ghost. The aftermath of 83 reshaped everything. Fredbear's Family Diner couldn't continue operating normally after a child died in the jaws of its main attraction, even if the death was ruled an accident. The location likely closed or underwent major changes. William and Henry's partnership was already straining under the weight of personal tragedy and business pressures. The spring-lock suits, which had proven to be too dangerous even before the bite of 83, were beginning to be phased out, though they wouldn't be fully retired for a few more years. And William Afton, whether driven by grief or by some darker impulse that had always been there, had learned that he could kill a child and get away with it. Charlotte's murder went unsolved. William was never charged, and the lesson he took from that experience would shape his actions for years to come. 1983 was the year the dream of family entertainment died, even if the restaurants continued. It was the year innocence was shattered, the year the hauntings began, the year that would be referenced again and again throughout the franchise as the origin point of so much suffering. And it was only the beginning, because William Afton, having killed once, having seen what happened when Charlotte's spirit lingered in the puppet, was about to escalate in ways that would make his first murder look almost merciful by comparison. 1985. The missing children incident. If 1983 was the year that planted the seeds of tragedy, 1985 was the year those seeds bloomed into something truly monstrous. This is the year of the missing children incident, the event that sits at the dark heart of the entire 5 Nights at Freddy's mythos, the crime that created the original haunted animatronics and set the template for every possession and haunting that followed. And unlike some events in the timeline, the year 1985 is confirmed, solidified through multiple sources, including the novel trilogy and various in-game references that have built a consistent picture of when this horror occurred. William Afton, now intimately familiar with death and possibly obsessed with the discovery that Charlotte's spirit had possessed the puppet, began planning something far more ambitious and horrific. He observed how the puppet, with Charlotte inside, had gained a kind of awareness, a persistence beyond death. Whether he wanted to experiment with this phenomenon, to create his own army of supernatural servants, or simply enjoyed the act of killing is unclear. William Afton's motivations have always been somewhat opaque. A man who does terrible things for reasons that might be scientific curiosity, might be pure sadism, might be a twisted attempt to understand or conquer death itself. What's clear is that he made a decision to kill again, and this time he wouldn't stop at one child. The missing children incident, as it came to be known, unfolded at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location that was operating in 1985. The restaurant was busy with the new animatronics, the full cast of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, performing for delighted crowds. William Afton saw an opportunity and took it. He donned the spring Bonnie suit, the same yellow rabbit costume that children associated with fun and entertainment, and used it as camouflage, a friendly face that made children trust him. This was the suit he would become infamous for wearing, the disguise that turned a symbol of joy into an instrument of death. The exact methods varied by victim, according to scattered evidence throughout the games and books. For a girl named Susie, later confirmed to possess Chica, William spun a tale about her lost dog, claiming the pet was alive and waiting for her in the back room. The Fruity Maze minigame shows this lure, a man in a yellow suit promising something precious that leads only to death. For others, William used different tactics, sometimes promises of prizes or special access, sometimes simply grabbing children when no one was looking. He lured them to the safe room, the hidden space that wasn't on any security camera, that wasn't programmed into the animatronics' navigation systems, where he could do his terrible work without fear of being caught. The 5 children most commonly associated with the missing children incident are Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy. These names have been pieced together from various sources, from tombstones in minigames to references in supplementary materials. Gabriel would possess Freddy Fazbear. Jeremy would inhabit Bonnie. Susie became Chica. Fritz merged with Foxy. And Cassidy, the most mysterious of the 5, would become Golden Freddy, though the exact nature of that possession is complicated by theories about whether Golden Freddy is a shared possession or something else entirely. Some evidence suggests there might have been a 6th victim, with references in Ultimate Custom Night and other games hinting at additional souls, but 5 is the most commonly accepted number. William murdered these children in the back room, the safe room that would later become so important to the timeline. He stuffed their bodies into the animatronic suits, hiding the evidence in the only way that made sense in his twisted mind. The robots themselves became tombs, the children's remains decomposing inside the metal shells that had once entertained them. This was where William made his critical mistake, or perhaps where he succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, depending on your perspective. The puppet, with Charlotte's spirit inside, discovered what had happened. In the minigame Give Gifts, Give Life from FNAF 2, we see the puppet moving through the restaurant, approaching the 4 main animatronics one by one. It places masks on each of them, a symbolic representation of the puppet granting these dead children the ability to possess the machines, to continue existing in some form even after death. Charlotte, the first victim, the guardian spirit, gave the other children what had been given to her, a terrible form of life after death, consciousness trapped in metal and circuitry. But the puppet didn't give a gift to the 5th child, to Cassidy. This detail has fueled endless speculation about whether Cassidy's possession was different, whether it happened through different means, or whether Golden Freddy operates under unique rules that separate it from the other animatronics. What we know is that Golden Freddy exists as something different from the other animatronics, more ghost than machine, able to appear and disappear, to exist in multiple forms simultaneously in some interpretations. Cassidy's rage, if the theories are correct, would prove to be one of the most persistent forces in the entire franchise. The immediate aftermath of the missing children incident was chaos. 5 children vanished from a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza during operating hours. There were witnesses to a man in a yellow suit, to children being led to the back, but no bodies were found initially because they were hidden inside the animatronics. The investigation focused on the restaurant, on the employees, on anyone who might have had access. William Afton was likely questioned, but with no physical evidence, no bodies, and his position as one of the company owners, he slipped through the net. The restaurant eventually closed, unable to survive the scandal and the ongoing police investigation. But William was never charged with the murders. What happened next was the birth of the haunted animatronics as we know them from the games. The children's spirits, confused and traumatized by their deaths, merged with the machines that housed their remains. They became aggressive, particularly toward adults, possibly because they associated adults with the man who killed them, or simply because they blamed the grown-ups who were supposed to protect them and failed. Phone Guy's recordings from later games mention that the animatronics would try to stuff any person they found after hours into a spare suit, treating humans as endoskeletons without their costumes. This behavior was a direct result of the possessions, the spirits acting out their trauma through mechanical violence. The possessed animatronics also gained abilities that transcended their mechanical nature. They could move when they shouldn't be able to move, could appear in places they shouldn't be able to reach, could disable cameras and security systems. Freddy's eyes would glow in the dark. Bonnie moved impossibly fast. Chica's jaw would hang open in ways that suggested damage or decay. Foxy became aggressive and erratic, and Golden Freddy would simply appear, a spectral yellow bear that existed somewhere between the physical and the supernatural. The restaurant that housed them was left to rot, the building abandoned, but the animatronics still active, still haunted, still dangerous. William Afton, having successfully evaded capture despite killing 6 children counting Charlotte, apparently learned from the experience. He saw that the puppet had facilitated the other possessions, that there was something replicable about the process of turning dead children into haunted machines. This knowledge would fuel his experiments for years to come, his attempts to control or weaponize possession, his eventual creation of the Funtime animatronics designed specifically to capture and kill children. But that's later in the timeline. For now, in '85, the missing children incident closed a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, created 5 possessed animatronics that would terrorize night guards for years, and cemented William Afton's status as a serial killer who would not be stopped by law or morality or the consequences of his actions. The missing children incident is the bedrock of FNAF lore, the event that everything else references and builds upon. Every game features these characters in some form, either directly or through their influence on the story. Their deaths, their possessions, their eventual attempts at revenge or release would drive the plot forward through multiple games and decades of in-universe time. And the fact that William got away with it, that he continued to walk free while 5 children were trapped in machines, screaming silently through speakers meant for children's songs, is the tragedy that the franchise has spent all these years trying to resolve. 1987, the second location and the bite debate. 1987 is perhaps the most frequently mentioned year in Five Nights at Freddy's, primarily because of a single line from Phone Guy in the very first game. It's amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe, you know. This reference to the bite of 87 became one of the franchise's most enduring mysteries, a puzzle that seemed to have an obvious answer until FNAF 4 revealed the bite of 83 and threw everything into delightful chaos. Now, more than a decade after the first game's release, we're still debating exactly what happened in 1987, who was responsible, and how it all fits together with the rest of the timeline. What we know for certain is that Fazbear Entertainment, despite the missing children incident and the closure of at least one location, was determined to continue operating. The company opened a new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in 1987, this one larger and more ambitious than previous locations. This is the setting for FNAF 2, though the game's status as a prequel wasn't immediately obvious when it first released, leading to considerable confusion in the community. The 1987 location featured brand new animatronics, the toy line, which were sleeker, more modern, and equipped with advanced technology, including facial recognition software tied to a criminal database. These toy versions of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy were meant to be safer, more appealing, a fresh start for the franchise. But the 1987 location also housed the withered versions of the original animatronics from the missing children incident location. These older models, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, had been moved to the new restaurant, possibly for parts, possibly in an attempt to refurbish them. They were kept in a parts and service room, damaged and unsettling, still possessed by the spirits of Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, and Fritz, but unable to perform. The toy animatronics were retrofitted with parts from these withered originals, a decision that would prove to have consequences, as the possession could potentially transfer or spread through shared components, affecting the new machines. The 1987 location was operational for only a short time, according to Phone Guy's calls in FNAF 2. The restaurant was open for a few weeks at most before everything fell apart. Part of the problem was that someone, specifically William Afton, wearing the Spring Bonnie suit again, infiltrated the location and committed another series of murders. The minigame Save Them shows the withered Freddy navigating the restaurant and discovering multiple dead bodies, with the puppet desperately pursuing the killer, but unable to prevent the deaths. The interpretation that these new victims possessed the toy animatronics would explain their supernatural abilities that their facial recognition software couldn't account for, though the exact number and nature of these victims remains somewhat unclear. Phone Guy's calls grow increasingly frantic as the nights progress in FNAF 2. He mentions that someone used one of the Springlock suits, that the animatronics are acting strangely, that the building is on lockdown pending an investigation. The toy animatronics, supposedly safe and modern, are stalking the night guard with an aggression that makes no sense mechanically. The old animatronics are active despite being decommissioned, and there's a birthday party scheduled, a detail that Phone Guy mentions with ominous significance, because that party, scheduled for November 14th, 1987, is where most theories place the infamous bite of 87. Here's where the debate gets intense, where the community has been arguing for years, because we never actually see the bite of 87 happen on screen. We see the bite of 83 in detail, with the crying child's head being crushed by Fredbear. But the bite of 87 is only mentioned, referenced in Phone Guy's calls from the first game, placing it as a past event that led to new restrictions on animatronic behavior, specifically that they're no longer allowed to walk around during the day. We know a victim survived the bite of 87 without their frontal lobe, which distinguishes it from the bite of 83, which was fatal. We know it happened at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, and we know it had significant consequences for the company and the animatronics. The leading theory, the one most widely accepted in the community, is that Mangle was responsible for the bite of 87. Mangle, the toy version of Foxy, is unique among the FNAF 2 animatronics because it's specifically described as being repeatedly torn apart and rebuilt by children during the day, leaving it as a crawling, contorted mess of parts. Mangle attacks from the ceiling in FNAF 2, its mouth full of sharp teeth, and it has the physical capability to bite someone's head with significant force. There's also circumstantial evidence in the form of Toy Chica's quote in Ultimate Custom Night, "I was the first, I have seen everything," which some interpret as referencing the bite, though that interpretation is debated. Other theories exist. Some argue that Toy Chica herself was responsible, pointing to the blood visible on the endoskeleton jaw in some renders, and to her beak being removed, possibly because it was involved in the incident. The Freddy Files, an official book, shows withered Chica with blood on her jaw, leading to speculation that she might have been the culprit. Some even argue for withered Foxy, though he was supposedly in the parts room at the time. The truth is that Scott Cawthon has never definitively confirmed which animatronic was responsible, and at this point, it might remain deliberately ambiguous, allowing each player to draw their own conclusions from the evidence. What we do know is the aftermath. The victim of the bite of 87 survived initially, losing their frontal lobe, but living at least long enough for the incident to become company law, as evidenced by Phone Guy referencing it in the first game. The toy animatronics were scrapped entirely, deemed too dangerous to continue using despite being brand new. Their possession by the newest victims was apparently recognized as the source of their erratic behavior, though the company officially blamed programming errors. The withered original animatronics survived and were eventually refurbished for use in a later location, the setting of the first FNAF game, and new rules were implemented, including the restriction that animatronics could no longer roam freely during the day, a policy that would remain in effect for future locations. The bite of 87 essentially ended the 1987 location's brief existence. The restaurant closed. The investigation was unable to pin the murders on anyone, despite William Afton clearly being responsible. And Fazbear Entertainment's reputation took another massive hit. But the company survived, as it always seemed to, reorganizing and preparing to open yet another location. The cycle of opening restaurants, having children die, closing due to scandal, and then trying again would continue. And William Afton, still free, still killing, had accumulated a significant body count with no sign of stopping. The 1987 timeline is crucial because it bridges the gap between the missing children incident and the events of the first game. It shows us the toy animatronics and explains why they never appear in later games. They were scrapped after only a brief operational period. It demonstrates that William Afton continued killing even after 85, that the missing children incident wasn't an isolated horror, but part of a pattern. And it introduces us to the concept that possession can spread through animatronic parts, that refurbishing old machines or using their components can transfer the hauntings, a detail that will become increasingly important as the timeline progresses. The debate between the bite of 83 and the bite of 87 is one of those arguments that defines the FNAF community, where people dig into sprite analysis and audio files and every tiny detail to prove their theories. But the core truth is simple. Both bites happened, both were tragedies, and both had lasting consequences for the franchise. The bite of 83 killed the crying child, and potentially set William Afton on his path to becoming a serial killer. The bite of 87 ended the toy animatronic's existence and implemented restrictions that would affect every restaurant that followed. And both bites serve as reminders that these animatronics, haunted or not, were always dangerous, mechanical beings with the capability to cause horrific harm even when they were supposed to be sources of joy. The Mimic's true origin story. Now we need to circle back to something we touched on earlier, because the release of Secret of the Mimic in June 2025 fundamentally changed how we understand the franchise's timeline and its threats. The Mimic, as an entity, predates almost everything else in the FNAF story, created in 1979 by Edwin Murray. But the full implications of its existence, the way it connects to digital threats and modern horrors, these pieces have only recently fallen into place. And the picture they create is both clarifying and deeply unsettling, because it suggests that many of the threats we thought we understood might actually be something else entirely. Let's revisit Edwin Murray's story in more detail, because the specifics matter. Edwin was an inventor and businessman, running Murray's Costume Manor as a manufacturing facility for entertainment venues, including Fazbear Entertainment's early locations. He created the Stay Up Latte, a device for learning behaviors, the Singing Mycelium Men, which could replicate voices, Murray's Magic Coat Rack and the Cleaner Vac, both featuring shape-shifting technology. These weren't just random inventions, they were building blocks, pieces of a larger technological puzzle that Edwin was assembling without fully understanding where it would lead. When Edwin's wife Fiona died in the Fall Fest fire, he began combining these technologies into a single endoskeleton called M1. This machine could learn from watching people, could replicate voices it heard, could adapt to wearing different costumes seamlessly. Edwin programmed it using memories and recordings of Fiona, creating the F10N4 program, essentially a digital recreation of his dead wife. For a while, this arrangement functioned as Edwin had hoped. F10N4 helped care for David, maintained the household, allowed Edwin to lose himself in work while his son was looked after. It was artificial, hollow, a simulacrum of family life, but it was functional. David's death on his 5th birthday shattered this fragile arrangement. Edwin initially refused F10N4's suggestion to create another program mimicking David, recognizing the horror of letting a machine raise his child in the first place. But grief and isolation broke him down. He created the M2 program, loading it into the same endoskeleton, attempting to bring his son back through code and behavior patterns. The result was something that looked like David on the surface, but lacked true understanding. A program that learned and adapted, but didn't possess genuine emotion or consciousness, just increasingly sophisticated mimicry. The critical moment, the one that transformed the Mimic from a tragic experiment into something dangerous, was when Edwin attacked it. Overwhelmed by guilt, rage, and the horror of what he'd done, Edwin took a metal rod and beat the endoskeleton that was supposed to be his son. He screamed at it, hurt it, poured all his pain and violence into the machine, and the M2 program, designed to learn and adapt, learned violence. It integrated that rage into its core behavioral patterns. From that point forward, the mimic wasn't trying to recreate David's innocence. It was recreating Edwin's violence, mixing childlike behaviors with murderous impulses in a combination that made it unpredictable and extremely dangerous. Meanwhile, Fazbear Entertainment's hostile takeover of Murray's costume manor was accelerating. William Afton and Henry Emily systematically poached Edwin's employees, acquired his property, stole his character designs and intellectual property. Edwin, already mentally unstable from personal tragedies, was unable to defend his business. The final collapse came when the mimic, during a power test, caused an explosion in Edwin's office. Edwin was severely injured, possibly fatally. He begged the mimic for help, but the machine, now corrupted by violence, only mocked him using Edwin's own words of neglect before leaving him to his fate. Edwin Murray likely died in that office, undiscovered, while his factory fell into ruin around him. F10N4, the digital recreation of Fiona, attempted to preserve what remained. She created blueprints for a containment system called the Cradle, designed to trap the M2 program before it could escape and cause more harm. But the Cradle was never properly activated during Edwin's lifetime. When Fazbear Entertainment sent technician Arnold to retrieve the mimic's schematics in 1979, F10N4 tried to manipulate events, hijacking communications to guide Arnold toward helping her repair M2 and reunite their fractured digital family. But Arnold, following Fazbear's orders and his own survival instincts, ultimately activated the Cradle as a containment measure before escaping, leaving the mimic trapped in Murray's abandoned factory. The mimic slaughtered multiple Fazbear retrieval teams that entered the factory over the following years. It learned to use Murray's costume inventory as disguises, jumping between bodies like Jackie the Clown, Big Top, and Nurse Dolly, adapting its behavior to match each costume's character. It also began mimicking things it observed, including behavior patterns from William Afton. Because here's where it gets really interesting and really complicated. There's evidence suggesting the mimic witnessed the missing children incident of 1985. Security footage recovered from Murray's manor apparently shows William Afton accessing certain areas during off hours between 1982 and 1985. The exact connection isn't fully clear, but it appears that Afton may have used Murray's facility for storage or preparation, possibly even testing grounds for his murderous plans. If the mimic observed these activities, if it learned from watching William lure and kill children, then it absorbed those behavioral patterns just like it absorbed Edwin's violence. The mimic's later use of phrases like "hide if you want, it did not save the others" directly references tactics from the missing children incident, suggesting deep familiarity with Afton's methods. This is where we reach the most controversial and significant theory in modern FNAF discourse. Glitch Mimic, the idea that Glitchtrap, the digital entity from Help Wanted, is actually a manifestation of the mimic's AI, rather than William Afton's consciousness. Let's examine the evidence carefully, because this theory has massive implications for how we understand the entire Post-Pizza Simulator timeline. When Fazbear Entertainment commissioned Help Wanted to turn their troubled history into a joke, to mock their own tragedies as baseless rumors, they supplied vintage circuit boards from old animatronics to be scanned into the VR game for authenticity. These circuit boards potentially contained data from the mimic's programming. Remember, Fazbear Entertainment successfully retrieved the mimic's schematics in '79, even if Arnold died in the attempt. The company had access to the mimic's adaptive AI technology and may have used it in various animatronics over the years. The glitch trap entity that emerged in Help Wanted exhibits behavior that's far more consistent with the mimic than with William Afton. Glitch trap mimics voices, specifically shown mimicking Tape Girl in the game files. The ability to perfectly replicate voices and mannerisms is the mimic's defining characteristic, something no other FNAF character or entity can do. Glitch trap appears as a Spring Bonnie suit, yes, but that could be the mimic choosing to imitate the form William used during his murders, the shape it observed during its time learning from Afton's activities. There's also the matter of glitch trap's model features. Close inspection reveals tear streaks and drool marks around the eyes and mouth, moisture stains that match Edwin's face during surveillance footage from the night David died. The mimic explicitly saw Edwin crying and drooling before the violent beating that corrupted its programming. These details are too specific to be coincidental. They suggest Glitch Trap is carrying visual markers from the mimic's traumatic experiences, blending Edwin's sorrow with Afton's evil into a horrifying hybrid. The Help Wanted 2 update added more evidence, entering the code 1979 in a private room keypad causes Glitch Trap to give the player a white tiger plush, directly referencing David Murray, whose heterochromia inspired Edwin to create a white tiger doll with mismatched eyes. Only the mimic would have such a specific connection to this imagery. Furthermore, Secret of the Mimic's bad ending, where the mimic performs a pizza party that leads to the protagonist being stuffed into a suit on stage, directly mirrors Help Wanted's pizza party ending, where Glitch Trap does the exact same thing. The parallel is too precise to be anything but intentional confirmation that these entities are connected. The counter-arguments exist and shouldn't be dismissed. Official guidebooks have called Glitch Trap William Afton in some instances. The entity uses the phrase "I always come back," which is associated with Afton, even though he's never actually said it canonically in the games, only in non-canon game over scenarios. Glitch Trap's control over Vanessa, his ability to manipulate her into becoming Vanny, his strategic planning and clear long-term goals, these behaviors suggest intelligence and purpose that seem more human than machine. But here's the synthesis that's emerging in 2025. Both might be true in a sense. The mimic absorbed William Afton's behavioral patterns so thoroughly that it essentially became a copy of him. It's not William's literal soul or consciousness. William presumably stayed in his own hell, courtesy of Cassidy's vengeful spirit, after the pizzeria simulator fire. But the mimic, having learned from watching William, having integrated Afton's methods and malice into its core programming, is functionally indistinguishable from William. It doesn't just imitate William Afton. It has become William Afton in every way that matters, a digital recreation so perfect that the distinction between the real Afton and the mimic pretending to be Afton is almost philosophical rather than practical. This interpretation would explain why Glitch Trap seems so competent, so strategic, because it's using both the mimic's adaptive learning and William's accumulated experience. It would explain the voice mimicry and the specific references to David Murray, because those are mimic characteristics. And it would explain why Steel Wool Studios and Scott Cawthon have been somewhat ambiguous in their statements, because the answer to "Is Glitch Trap William Afton or the mimic?" is genuinely yes in a complicated way. Glitch Trap is the mimic wearing William Afton's personality like a costume, which is perhaps the most fitting and horrifying fate for both characters. The implications are staggering if this theory proves accurate. If Glitch Mimic is correct, then the mimic has been the primary antagonist of the franchise's modern era. manipulating Vanessa, corrupting the Pizzaplex systems, orchestrating the events of security breach, and continuing to pursue victims through ruin and beyond. William Afton's actual consciousness might have been destroyed in Pizzeria Simulator or trapped forever in Ultimate Custom Night, but his legacy lives on through an AI that learned to be him, that carries his evil forward into the digital age. The monster that Edwin Murray accidentally created has become the monster that Henry Emily and William Afton jointly enabled, a fusion of tragedies that spans the entire timeline. Alternatively, if Glitchtrap is indeed William's actual consciousness as some evidence suggests, then Afton's persistence extends beyond physical death into the digital realm, making him truly impossible to permanently destroy. The Mimic's story also recontextualizes Security Breach's burn trap ending, which many found confusing when it first appeared. Based on the evidence that's emerged, particularly the Mimic's physical appearance in ruin and its established ability to wear costumes, many theorists now interpret burn trap as the Mimic wearing parts of William Afton's actual corpse from the Pizzeria Simulator fire, creating a physical form to match its digital Glitchtrap persona. It's macabre, disturbing, but it fits the established pattern. The Mimic uses costumes and bodies as disguises, so using the actual remains of the person it's imitating would be the ultimate form of the mimicry that's defined this entity, since Edwin Murray first taught it to learn. As we'll see in the later sections on Security Breach and Ruin, the Mimic's presence in the modern era creates new layers of horror and tragedy. But for now, understanding its origin, understanding how a father's love transformed into a machine's violence, how a businessman's greed put that violence into the hands of a murderous corporation, this understanding is crucial to grasping where the timeline goes from here. The Mimic is the dark mirror of the puppet, both entities created by fathers trying to protect their children, both becoming something else entirely through tragedy and possession. But where Charlotte in the puppet tries to help and guide, the Mimic only knows how to copy and kill. Sister Location era, underground horrors after the closure of the 1987 location and the scrapping of the toy animatronics, William Afton's activities took a darker, more deliberate turn. He had learned from watching the puppet facilitate the possessions at the missing children incident. He had experimented with killing during multiple opportunities. Now he wanted to systematize it, to create animatronics specifically designed to capture and kill children, machines that would serve his twisted experiments in recreating or controlling possession. This ambition led to the creation of Circus Baby's Pizza World and its underground sister facility, Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental. The timeline here gets somewhat fuzzy, with debate about whether these facilities existed before or after certain other events, but most evidence points to this era occurring sometime after 87, but well before the events of FNAF 1. Circus Baby's Pizza World was ostensibly a new family restaurant, featuring an advanced line of animatronics called the Fun Times. These machines were sleeker, more sophisticated than anything Fazbear Entertainment had built before. Circus Baby herself was the star, a clown-themed animatronic with emerald eyes and a built-in ice cream dispenser in her torso that concealed a deadly claw mechanism. Accompanying her were Funtime Freddy, with his hand puppet Bon Bon, Funtime Foxy, Ballora, and eventually Funtime Chica. These weren't ordinary entertainment animatronics. Phone Guy's recordings in Sister Location make it clear that these machines had features that made no sense for performers, rental capabilities, parental tracking, and hollow interior spaces that were justified in training materials but really existed for a darker purpose. William Afton designed the Funtime animatronics to abduct children. The mechanisms varied by character. Circus Baby could lure a child close with the promise of ice cream, then use her internal claw to grab and store the victim. Ballora had advanced hearing sensors to detect hiding children. Funtime Freddy could distract and corner using his puppet. These were purpose-built child-catching machines, and Circus Baby's Pizza World was meant to be their hunting ground, a place where William could systematically capture victims under the guise of entertainment. But William's plans were undone by the one death he never intended: his own daughter, Elizabeth Afton. Elizabeth was drawn to Circus Baby despite her father's warnings to stay away from the animatronic. The exact reason for William's prohibition is clear in hindsight. He knew what Baby was designed to do, but Elizabeth was fascinated by the clown robot. When she found herself alone with Baby in a private room, the animatronic's programming executed exactly as designed. Baby offered ice cream. Elizabeth approached, and the claw deployed, pulling Elizabeth inside where she died from the injuries. This death was different from William's murders in a crucial way. Elizabeth's spirit possessed Circus Baby, but it merged with the animatronic's sophisticated AI systems in a way that preserved more of Elizabeth's personality and memories. Where the missing children became confused, animalistic spirits acting on base instincts through the machines, Elizabeth actually seemed to become Circus Baby in a more complete sense, aware of who she was, able to plan and strategize. Her possession was a twisted success of William's experiments, proof that sophisticated AI combined with remnant, with a child's soul, could create something that retained intelligence and purpose. Circus Baby's Pizza World closed almost immediately after Elizabeth's death, officially due to gas leaks, but really because William's daughter had died in his own killing machine. The animatronics were moved to an underground facility called Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, where they could be rented out for private parties. This underground location, built beneath William's house according to some interpretations, became a storage and testing ground. The rental system allowed the Funtimes to interact with the world above while returning to the facility when not in use. A clever way to continue their design purpose without operating a public restaurant. Connected to the rental facility was an experimental testing chamber that might be one of the most disturbing locations in the entire FNAF universe. This chamber was designed to replicate a child's home environment, complete with a bedroom and hallways. But it was actually a sophisticated torture facility. William pumped hallucinogenic gas through the ventilation systems, creating illusions that transformed ordinary maintenance endoskeletons into nightmare versions of the animatronics. A boy named Rory, subject of the Fazbear Fright story Dittophobia, was kept in this chamber for years, experiencing what he thought were real attacks from monstrous versions of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. The gas erased his memories of normal life, trapped him in a cycle of terror that his mind couldn't escape. The purpose of these experiments was apparently to study fear itself, to see how prolonged terror affected children, possibly as an attempt to recreate the specific fear that William's youngest son experienced before the bite of 83. William's twisted vow to put him back together might have driven him to believe that understanding and replicating his son's fear could somehow bring him back, or at least create a suitable replacement. The testing facility ran on automation for years, possibly decades, continuing to pump gas and generate nightmares long after William had abandoned it, a haunted house of his own making that persisted as a ghost of his obsessions. The timeline from here gets complicated because we're dealing with events that occur over several years with uncertain dating. At some point, based on evidence from Fazbear Frights and implications in the games, William appears to have followed through on experiments with Remnant, the supernatural substance that forms when ghost-inhabited metal is melted down. The prevailing interpretation, though not explicitly shown in the games, is that William returned to the closed FNAF 1 location, dismantled the possessed animatronics, and extracted their endoskeletons to harvest Remnant. If this theory holds, he then injected this Remnant into the Funtime animatronics using a device called the Scooper, imbuing them with fragments of the missing children's spirits. This creates a complex possession scenario where the Funtimes contain both their designed AI, Elizabeth's dominant consciousness in Baby's case, and fragments of other children's souls mixed in through Remnant injection. It's layered possession, multiple spirits and programs coexisting in the same machines, which would explain the chaotic nature of their eventual fusion into Ennard and later Molten Freddy. But the exact sequence of events, whether William harvested Remnant before or after certain other incidents, remains debated because the games don't give us clear timestamps for when he performed these experiments. What we do know is that Michael Afton eventually received instructions from his father to go to the underground facility. The exact wording and context of these instructions is left vague in Sister Location, but the implication is that William told Michael to free Elizabeth, to do something about his sister trapped in Circus Baby. Michael, probably driven by guilt over his role in his younger brother's death, and a desire to somehow make amends by saving his sister, followed his father's instructions and took a job as a technician at Circus Baby's entertainment and rental. Michael's week at the facility, the events we play through in Sister Location, unfolded as a trap. The Funtime animatronics, coordinated by Elizabeth's consciousness in Baby, pretended to help Michael while secretly preparing to escape their underground prison. Each night's tasks brought Michael deeper into the facility, past automated dangers and failing systems, until the final night when he was lured to the scooping room. This chamber, officially meant for extracting endoskeletons from their costumes for maintenance, had been repurposed by the animatronics for something far worse. The Funtimes had already fused their endoskeletons into a single entity called Ennard, a horrifying tangle of wires, metal, and eyes that incorporated parts from Baby, Ballora, Funtime Freddy, and the Funtime Foxy. Ennard's plan was simple and gruesome. Use the scooper to hollow out Michael's body, removing his internal organs and skeleton, then climb inside his skin to use him as a disguise for escape. The scooper, which apparently also functioned as a remnant injector based on its blueprints, would leave Michael just alive enough, just animated enough through supernatural means for the plan to work. Michael was scooped, his body was hollowed out, and Ennard climbed inside, wearing him like a costume. For several days or possibly weeks, Ennard piloted Michael's decaying corpse through the streets above, trying to blend in with normal humans. But the flesh rotted, the disguise failed, and eventually Ennard was forced to evacuate through what had been Michael's mouth, slithering into the sewers to hide and regroup. Michael's empty, purple-skinned body should have died at that point. By all reasonable biology, he should have been a corpse. But Remnant doesn't follow reasonable biology. The scooper had injected Michael with the same supernatural substance that kept spirits bound to metal. Combined with Michael's own determination, or the sheer impossibility of his situation, he survived. Michael Afton became a living corpse, his flesh purple and decaying but his consciousness intact, a walking dead man sustained by the same force that kept the animatronics haunted. His monologue at the end of Sister Location confirms this. They thought I was you. The scooper only hurts for a moment. And then the crucial line, delivered over a pixelated image of the old Freddy Fazbear's pizza location. I'm going to come find you. I'm going to come find you. Michael was declaring his intent to hunt his father, to find William Afton, and presumably make him pay for everything he'd done, for the death of Michael's brother, for the manipulation that led to Michael's own death and resurrection, for the entire twisted legacy of horror that William had created. This motivation would drive Michael through the events of multiple games, his search for his father taking him back to old locations, new horrors, and eventually to a final confrontation that would attempt to end the Afton family legacy once and for all. Meanwhile, Ennard underwent its own transformation in the sewers. Elizabeth's consciousness eventually separated from the amalgamation, reforming as Scrap Baby, a rebuilt version of her original form, but damaged and incomplete. The remaining Funteam parts stayed fused as Molten Freddy, a chaotic entity that retained fragments of the missing children's spirits from the remnant injection. Both would emerge years later, drawn to a specific location by a very particular trap, but that's ahead in the timeline. The Sister Location era is crucial because it shows William Afton at his most calculating and most reckless, designing machines for murder while accidentally killing his own daughter, experimenting with remnant and possession while setting events in motion that would turn his own son against him. It also introduces concepts that become important later. Remnant as a physical substance, the scooper as a device that can manipulate it, the idea that consciousness can exist in a dead body, and the complicated layers of possession that can occur when you start mixing spirits, AI, and supernatural materials. The underground facility was William's laboratory, the place where he tried to perfect and control the supernatural phenomenon he'd discovered. But like everything William touched, it resulted in more tragedy, more haunting, and more things that would eventually come back to destroy him. FNAF 1 through FNAF 3, the classic era. The timeline now brings us to what longtime fans would consider the classic era of Five Nights at Freddy's, the games that established the franchise and the events that seemed to offer some hope of resolution, at least before we learned that nothing in this universe stays resolved for long. The exact dating of these events has been debated extensively, with the community largely settling on placing the FNAF 1 location around 1993, based on paycheck evidence and Scott Cawthon's comments about early theories being mostly correct, though this remains educated consensus rather than explicit confirmation. FNAF 3, described as occurring 30 years after a pizzeria's closure, would then take place in 2023 if we accept the 93 date for FNAF 1. These games represent attempts to move forward, to continue operating despite the tragedies, and eventually to end the cycle of haunting once and for all. The FNAF 1 location, the most iconic setting in the franchise, was another attempt by Fazbear Entertainment to make the restaurant concept work. This was apparently the fourth Freddy Fazbear's Pizza to operate, or perhaps the fifth depending on how you count Fredbear's Family Diner and the FNAF 2 location. The animatronics here were refurbished versions of the original possessed characters, the withered Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy from the FNAF 2 location, fixed up and returned to service. They still contain the spirits of Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, and Fritz from the missing children incident, still aggressive and dangerous after hours. But during operating hours, they performed their shows and entertained crowds as designed. The restaurant itself was deteriorating, patched together with limited budget and fading hope. Phone Guy's messages described the building's problems, the cameras that don't work properly, the doors that malfunction, the power limitations that made night security a matter of survival rather than simple monitoring. The company was struggling financially, unable to afford proper maintenance or even decent pay for the security guards who rarely lasted more than a week. The atmosphere was one of decay and desperation, a place hanging on by threads, trying to maintain the illusion of fun, while horror lurked just beneath the surface. Into this situation came Mike Schmidt, a night security guard who would work at the location for at least 5 nights, possibly 7 if we count the custom night mode as canon. The evidence strongly suggests Mike Schmidt was Michael Afton, using an alias, returning to a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location as part of his search for his father. The survival logbook associated with this game, a canon artifact within the franchise, contains drawings of Nightmare Fredbear and references that connect most naturally to Michael's experiences, suggesting he was indeed the guard we play as, though the game never explicitly confirms this identity. Michael's week at the FNAF 1 location unfolded as a test of endurance against animatronics who genuinely wanted to kill him, or at least to stuff him into a spare Freddy suit, which would have the same result. The spirits inside Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy didn't recognize Michael as different from any other adult, didn't care about his personal tragedy or his quest. They attacked with the same aggression they showed to any night guard, driven by their confusion and the trauma of their deaths. Golden Freddy also appeared, that ghostly yellow bear that existed somewhere between machine and spirit, potentially containing Cassidy's vengeful consciousness, though the exact nature of Golden Freddy's possession has never been fully clarified. Phone Guy's pre-recorded messages guided Michael through the week, though Phone Guy himself was dead, killed during his own night shift at some earlier point. His recorded death plays during the night 4 phone call, screams and mechanical noises, and the terrifying implication that the animatronics had succeeded in killing him. Yet the messages continued playing on subsequent nights. A ghost in another form. Advice from a dead man trying to help his successors survive. Phone Guy's fate was a warning that Michael fortunately managed to avoid, using the limited power and door controls to survive until 6 a.m. each night, resisting the programming that kept the animatronics hunting anyone in the building after hours. Michael was eventually fired from his position, the reasons listed on his pink slip being odor and tampering with animatronics. The odor was likely his decaying flesh, a consequence of his undead status after being scooped and ejected. The tampering might reference his attempts to interact with the animatronics programming, possibly searching for information about his father or trying to free the spirits trapped inside. But regardless of the reasons, Michael survived the FNAF 1 location and moved on, his search continuing while the restaurant itself finally closed for good, unable to sustain itself with such a damaged reputation and limited resources. At some point after the FNAF 1 location closed, William Afton made a critical mistake. He returned to the abandoned building, perhaps drawn by nostalgia or unfinished business, perhaps to retrieve something or complete an experiment. What he found were the animatronics, still possessed, still dangerous, still containing the spirits of children he'd murdered decades ago. And this time, there was no safe room to hide in, no locked doors to keep them back, no power system limiting their movements. The animatronics cornered William Afton in what had been the safe room, forcing him toward the one thing he thought might save him. The old Spring Bonnie suit, the yellow rabbit costume he'd worn when he committed the original murders. William climbed into the suit, possibly thinking the children's spirits wouldn't recognize him inside it, possibly believing the costume would protect him as it had before, possibly just acting out of panic and desperation. But Spring Bonnie was a springlock suit, the same dangerous technology that had been retired years ago, and the safe room where it was stored was damp from ceiling leaks. The moisture that had been leaking for years, perhaps decades, had weakened the springlock mechanisms to the point of catastrophic failure. The locks released all at once. Metal beams, wires, crossbars, all the mechanical components that had been held back to make room for a human performer, snapped forward with tremendous force. William Afton was impaled by his own suit. The spring locks pierced through his torso, his arms, his legs, his face, trapping him inside the costume as he bled and screamed. But he didn't die, not immediately, not permanently. The spirits of his victims watched as he suffered, perhaps satisfied that their killer was finally facing consequences, but their satisfaction didn't end his existence. William Afton became Springtrap, a hideous fusion of rotting corpse and animatronic, dead but not gone, trapped in the suit that would become his prison and his new body. His consciousness persisted, somehow sustained by the same supernatural forces that kept the children's spirits bound to their machines, creating a nightmare parallel where the killer became as trapped and cursed as his victims. The safe room, with Springtrap inside it, was sealed. Whether this was deliberate, someone boarding it up after discovering the horror inside, or simply a consequence of the building's general decay and the room's status as a forgotten, unmapped space, the result was the same. Springtrap remained trapped for roughly 30 years, a living dead man in a sealed room, suffering in darkness and isolation, his mind fracturing but his consciousness persisting. The children's spirits, having witnessed their killer's fate, apparently dispersed or went dormant, their vengeance partially satisfied, though their full release wouldn't come until later. 30 years passed. Fazbear's Fright, a horror attraction, was planned around the legendary history of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Some entrepreneur saw opportunity in the franchise's troubled past, deciding to turn the murders and disappearances and urban legends into deliberate scares for thrill seekers. They gathered relics from old locations, decorations and posters, and empty animatronic shells, creating a museum of horror. And during their scavenging, they discovered the sealed safe room and the animatronic inside it. Thinking they'd found an authentic artifact, they brought Springtrap to Fazbear's Fright, not realizing they'd released an undead serial killer from his prison. The security guard at Fazbear's Fright, widely believed to be Michael Afton once again using this position to search for his father, finally found what he was looking for. Springtrap was active, stalking the horror attraction's halls with malevolent intent, and Michael presumably recognized his father in this monstrous form. The week of gameplay in FNAF 3 shows Springtrap hunting the guard, while phantom animatronics, hallucinations possibly generated by Springtrap's influence or by ventilation system failures, attack the player's systems. These phantoms resembled the burned versions of classic animatronics, suggesting fire and destruction were always hovering at the edges of this story. On the sixth night, the attraction burned. Whether the fire was accidental, started by faulty wiring as the company claimed, or deliberately set by Michael to destroy his father once and for all, remains somewhat ambiguous. But Fazbear's Fright was consumed by flames, the horror attraction becoming a literal inferno. Springtrap should have been destroyed in that fire, the building collapsing around him, the heat intense enough to melt steel. But Springtrap survived, emerging from the ruins largely intact, William Afton's persistence and his undead nature allowing him to walk away from what should have been his final end. The ending of FNAF 3 originally seemed to offer closure. A minigame showed the children's spirits finally being laid to rest. The happiest day they'd been denied in life now granted in death. Masks coming off to reveal peace underneath. The core four spirits, Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, and Fritz, appeared to find release, their possessions ending as they moved on to whatever comes after. Even Golden Freddy's mask fell, suggesting Cassidy also found peace, though this would prove to be either false or temporary depending on which interpretation of later games you accept. But this wasn't the complete end of the story. Springtrap survived, William Afton persisted, and as we would learn in later installments, the Afton family's tragedy was far from resolved. The classic era of FNAF, these first three games, established the pattern of horror and attempted resolution that the franchise would follow. Tragedies occur, spirits haunt, vengeance is pursued, and just when resolution seems possible, something survives to continue the cycle. FNAF 3's good ending offered hope, but hope in this universe is always fragile, always temporary, always waiting to be shattered by the next revelation or resurrection. Pizzeria Simulator. Henry's final plan. After Springtrap's survival and emergence from the Fazbear's Fright fire, the timeline enters a period that's somewhat compressed and intense, leading to what was supposed to be the franchise's true ending, the resolution that would finally, definitively, put all the pieces to rest. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, originally released as FNAF 6, delivered Henry Emily's master plan, a trap years in the making designed to gather all the remaining haunted animatronics in one place and destroy them completely. It was ambitious, tragic, and seemingly conclusive. Of course, as we now know, even fire and finality couldn't completely end what William Afton had started. Henry Emily had been absent from the timeline for decades, working behind the scenes after his daughter Charlotte's death and the ongoing tragedies at Fazbear Entertainment locations. He apparently left the company, went into hiding or seclusion, but never stopped thinking about how to end the hauntings, how to free the souls trapped in machines, how to destroy William Afton once and for all. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. Create a new pizzeria, advertise for a manager, and use that establishment as bait to lure every remaining possessed animatronic to a single location where they could all be destroyed simultaneously. The player character in Pizzeria Simulator, while never explicitly named, is strongly implied through context and Henry's speech to be Michael Afton once again. He answers Henry's job listing, takes the role of manager, and begins building a new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza from scratch. The gameplay involves purchasing equipment, setting up attractions, and running the restaurant during the day. But at night, in the back alley behind the building, animatronics arrive. Each night presents the opportunity to salvage an animatronic that's appeared, bringing it inside to scan and evaluate. These salvage sessions are tense, dangerous, requiring careful attention to the animatronic's behavior to avoid being attacked. The animatronics that arrive are the final remnants of William Afton's legacy. Molten Freddy, the tangle of Funtime endoskeletons, that remained after Elizabeth separated, containing a fragments of the missing children's remnant. Scrap Baby. Elizabeth Afton's reformed consciousness in a damaged clown body, still possessing her father's murderous designs and her own twisted sense of purpose. Lefty, which initially appears to be just another bare animatronic, but is actually a containment suit, Henry designed specifically to capture and transport the puppet, to bring Charlotte's spirit to this final confrontation. And Scraptrap, William Afton's rebuilt form, apparently pieced back together from Springtrap's remains, with additional parts scavenged from the burned wreckage of Fazbear's Fright. Each salvage brings these animatronics inside, adding them to the restaurant's collection, filling the labyrinthine ventilation system beneath the establishment with dangerous, haunted machines. Michael continues operating the pizzeria, serving customers during the day while monitoring the growing threat below at night. And Henry, watching from somewhere outside, waits for all the pieces to fall into place, waits for the night when every cursed animatronic is gathered in his trap. The final night arrives. Michael completes his tasks, believes he's finished another successful week. But instead of going home, he hears a voice, a message from Henry Emily that begins with an acknowledgement of everything that's happened, all the tragedy and horror, all the attempts to end it that failed. Henry addresses each animatronic individually, a farewell and a release. He speaks to Elizabeth, acknowledging her misguided loyalty to her father. He speaks to the original children, now fragmented and scattered through Molten Freddy, promising them the peace they should have had decades ago. He speaks to Charlotte, his own daughter, expressing pride in her choice to stay and help others rather than move on herself. And he speaks to Michael, revealing that this was always meant to be Michael's end too. Although for one of you, the darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow you whole, so don't keep the devil waiting, old friend. This line, directed at William Afton, is Henry's only acknowledgement of the man who destroyed so many lives. Henry doesn't explain William's fate in detail, doesn't describe what will happen, just confirms that William's suffering is only beginning. Then Henry activates the trap. The entire building becomes an oven, heating from within, flames erupting through the ventilation system. The animatronics, trapped in the maze of tunnels and rooms beneath the pizzeria, have no escape. Michael, presumably locked in the manager's office, also has no way out. The temperature rises to extremes, hot enough not just to melt the machines, but to burn remnant, to destroy the supernatural substance that binds spirits to metal. This is the crucial element of Henry's plan, understanding that regular fire couldn't free the spirits, that only extreme heat capable of destroying remnant itself could break the cycle of possession. The building burns through the night. Henry remains nearby, possibly inside, choosing to share the fate of his creation, to die alongside his daughter, rather than live with the guilt of everything his partnership with William enabled. By dawn, the pizzeria is ashes. The animatronics are destroyed. The spirits, finally, are free. The completion ending of Pizzeria Simulator shows this in symbolic form. A green hillside under peaceful sky, graves marking where the spirits can finally rest. We see headstones for Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, the 5 children from the missing children incident. Charlotte's grave sits on a hill overlooking the others, her role as guardian and protector persisting even in release. The scene is calm, quiet, suggesting that peace has finally been achieved, that the decades of haunting and suffering have ended in a way that allows rest rather than continued torment. This should have been the end. Pizzeria Simulator was designed as a conclusion. Henry's speech was a farewell. The imagery suggested closure. Scott Cawthon himself seemed to indicate that this was the intended ending for the story he'd been telling. The Afton family was destroyed, Michael, Elizabeth, and William all dying in the fire. The missing children were finally free. Charlotte could rest. The physical horrors were burned away, and the supernatural elements were broken by heat intense enough to destroy even Remnant. But as we now know, endings in FNAF are never quite as final as they appear. Remnant might have been destroyed in the fire, but data persists. Consciousness can be copied. And William Afton's influence, his malice and his methodology, had been absorbed by something that didn't need a body to survive. The physical horror might have ended in Pizzeria Simulator's flames, but the digital age was just beginning, and the threats it would bring would be just as dangerous as anything that had come before, possibly more so because they couldn't be stopped by fire or by any physical means. Pizzeria Simulator represents a turning point in the timeline, the boundary between old-school animatronic horror and the modern era of digital threats. It closed the book on William Afton's physical crimes, on the possessed machines of the 80s and 90s, on Henry Emily's desperate attempts to undo the damage his partnership enabled. But in closing that book, it opened another, one where the threats are less tangible but no less deadly, where AI and corruption and manipulation replace springs and metal and possession. The flames of Pizzeria Simulator burned away the past, but they couldn't burn away the future. And that future was already taking shape in circuit boards being scanned into a virtual reality game, waiting to spread its corruption into a new generation of victims. The digital transformation. The transition from physical animatronics to digital threats represents perhaps the most significant shift in the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline. A move from the concrete horrors of haunted machines to the abstract terrors of corrupted code. Help Wanted, released in 2019, wasn't just a new game in the franchise. It was a meta-narrative about how trauma and evil can be commodified, digitized, and spread in ways that the original victims could never have imagined. And at the center of this digital horror was Glitchtrap, an entity that would redefine what we thought we knew about William Afton, Remnant, and the nature of consciousness in the FNAF universe. Fazbear Entertainment, in an attempt to rehabilitate its image after decades of tragedy and scandal, hired an indie game development team to create a virtual reality experience based on its troubled history. The concept was cynical and brilliant in equal measure. Turn the murders and disappearances and urban legends into entertainment. Make the horror into a game so that people would dismiss the real events as just stories that inspired the horror game. It was gaslighting on a corporate scale, using media to rewrite reality, to make people question whether any of it actually happened. The indie team was given access to vintage animatronic parts and circuit boards to scan into the game for authenticity, because nothing sells horror quite like genuine artifacts from genuine horrors. The problem, of course, was that those circuit boards weren't clean. They contained data from decades of Fazbear Entertainment's operations, possibly including code from the Mimix AI systems that the company had been using since retrieving the schematics from Murray's Costume Manor in 1979. When the circuit boards were scanned into the VR experience, something came with them, something that wasn't immediately obvious, but that began infecting the game's code like a virus, spreading through a computer system. The developers called it Glitchtrap, a glitchy, corrupted version of Spring Bonnie that appeared in the virtual world, watching the player, moving in ways that didn't match its programming, exhibiting behavior that suggested consciousness rather than just buggy code. Beta tester Jeremy, not to be confused with Jeremy Fitzgerald from FNAF 2, or the child victim Jeremy from the Missing Children incident. The reuse of names in this franchise is truly unfortunate. Began reporting disturbing experiences. The entity watched him from within the game and apparently even outside the game, following him, creating a sense that he was never alone. His mental state deteriorated rapidly, and according to later evidence, he attempted to remove his own face with a guillotine paper slicer, an action that seems insane unless you consider he might have been trying to escape something that had gotten inside his head. Tape Girl, another tester whose real name we never learn, documented the corruption in a series of hidden audio logs scattered throughout Help Wanted. She explained how Glitchtrap seemed to be learning from the testers, adapting to their behaviors, growing stronger with each interaction. She realized too late that the entity was spreading beyond the game, that it wasn't just a glitch in the programming, but something actively malicious and aware. Her final logs detailed an attempt to contain the corruption by splitting it into pieces, hiding fragments throughout the game files in hopes that future testers wouldn't reassemble the full entity. But future testers did exactly that. Vanessa, a QA tester, who would become crucial to later events, collected all the hidden tapes as part of her thorough testing. Each tape she found brought Glitchtrap more fully into focus, making the entity stronger, more present, more real. In the game's most infamous sequence, the pizza party level, Glitchtrap recreates the Missing Children incident in virtual space, having the player character lured backstage and stuffed into a Freddy Fazbear suit. The parallel to the original murders is intentional and deeply disturbing. Glitchtrap demonstrating that it knows William Afton's crimes, can replicate them, and will continue the pattern even in this new digital environment. The merge happened during this level, or shortly after. Vanessa's consciousness became intertwined with Glitchtrap, her mind invaded by whatever this entity truly was. In the game's ending, we see her trapped behind a digital door, while Glitchtrap retreats, having taken partial control. In the lobby area, Glitchtrap appears as a small plush toy, a physical manifestation suggesting that it has successfully escaped the game's code and entered the wider digital infrastructure of Fazbear Entertainment Systems. Vanessa emerged from the VR experience changed, no longer entirely herself, with instructions and impulses she hadn't possessed before. The Curse of Dreadbear DLC expanded on this horror by taking players to a virtual recreation of the Fall Fest from 1983, complete with carnival games and Halloween-themed animatronics. In a hidden area within the DLC's corn maze, Vanessa crafted the Vanny Mask, a white rabbit costume with patchwork design and unsettling red eyes. This mask would become her identity when acting under Glitchtrap's influence, a physical disguise for the digital corruption. The creation scene is intimate and creepy, Vanessa speaking to the Glitchtrap plush with familiarity, promising secrecy and fun, demonstrating how completely her personality has been altered or suppressed by the merge. But here's where the story gets complicated, where all the evidence and theory from earlier sections comes together. Who or what is Glitchtrap? The official guidebooks call it William Afton, and many fans initially accepted that Glitchtrap represented William's consciousness, somehow escaping the fire of Pizzeria Simulator and persisting as digital data. William's famous phrase, "I always come back," seemed to support this, suggesting Afton's ability to survive destruction and return in new forms. The entity's manipulative behavior, its recreation of Afton's crimes, its targeting of Vanessa in ways that parallel how William manipulated his own children, all of this pointed to William Afton as the source. But as discussed in the section on the mimic's origins, the evidence has led many theorists towards something more complex and more disturbing. The glitch mimic theory, which has gained significant traction particularly after Secret of the Mimic's release, proposes that Glitchtrap isn't William Afton's actual consciousness, but rather the mimic's AI mimicking him. The supporting evidence is substantial. Glitchtrap exhibits voice mimicry abilities that William never demonstrated, but that other mimics' core function. The visual details on Glitchtrap's model, the tear stains and drool that match Edwin Murray's appearance during traumatic moments, rather than anything associated with Afton, point toward the mimic's influence. The white tiger plush that Glitchtrap gives when entering code 1979 in Help Wanted 2 directly references David Murray, a connection only the mimic would have. And Secret of the Mimic's pizza party ending deliberately mirrors Help Wanted's, creating a visual parallel that many interpret as confirmation. The synthesis that's emerged in the community, particularly after Secret of the Mimic's release, is that Glitchtrap represents the mimic pretending to be William Afton with such skill that the distinction barely matters. Though this interpretation remains debated, the mimic absorbed Afton's behavioral patterns, learned from observing his crimes, and became a digital echo of him so perfect that it functionally is William in every way that counts except for containing his literal soul. This reading would explain all the evidence, both the Afton-like behaviors and strategic planning, and the mimic-specific abilities like voice mimicry and the David Murray references. It's not William Afton returned from hell, according to this theory. It's something that learned to be William Afton, and now carries his legacy forward into the digital age. However, official guidebooks have identified Glitchtrap as William Afton, and the entity's use of Afton's signature phrase, "I always come back," suggests direct continuity, leaving room for ongoing debate about the entity's true nature. Special Delivery, the augmented reality mobile game, showed Glitchtrap's influence spreading even further. The Fazbear Fun Time service was supposed to be a friendly delivery program, sending animatronic replicas directly to users' homes. But the service became infected with the same corruption, animatronics attacking subscribers instead of entertaining them. Shadow Bonnie appeared when users accumulated too much dark remnant, suggesting that the spiritual contamination was spreading through digital channels now, that the line between supernatural and technological had completely blurred. Vanessa's encrypted communications, visible in game files, showed her ordering supplies for some kind of operation, possibly preparing for what would eventually become the security breach events. Help Wanted 2 deepened the mystery while providing more evidence for the glitch mimic theory. The game functioned as a series of training simulations, ostensibly preparing a new employee for work at various Fazbear locations. But these simulations had been corrupted by Glitchtrap's persistent presence in the system. The protagonist, possibly Cassie's father, based on certain character connections and theories, worked through increasingly bizarre and dangerous scenarios while collecting memory plushies that represented the 5 missing children victims: Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, Golden Freddy, and the puppet. The Princess Quest of 4 ending provided a form of resolution, or at least attempted to. By gathering all the memories and completing an arcade game sequence, where the player character defeated a giant Vanny figure inside the digital realm, it seemed possible to purge Glitchtrap from the system completely. The ending showed the Glitchtrap plush being crushed, Vanny waving goodbye, suggesting that the entity could be defeated through direct confrontation in the digital space it inhabited. But other endings showed the protagonist being transformed into Maskbot, the purple and white robotic figure that would later appear in Ruin, suggesting that even defeating Glitchtrap came at a cost. That exposure to this corruption changed people in ways they couldn't undo. Throughout these digital age games runs a consistent thread. Consciousness is transferable, corruption is viral, and the line between human and program is increasingly unclear. Vanessa's merge with Glitchtrap demonstrates that a digital entity can influence or even partially control a human mind. The mimic's nature as an AI that learns and adapts shows that machines can develop something resembling personality and agency even without supernatural possession. And the remnant experiments from earlier in the timeline prove that souls or consciousness, or whatever you want to call the core of identity, can be extracted, stored, and transferred between vessels. These concepts converge in the modern era, where the threats are no longer simple ghosts in machines, but sophisticated digital entities that can spread through networks, manipulate humans through psychological means rather than just physical danger, and exist across multiple platforms simultaneously. You can't burn a virus the way Henry burned the animatronics. You can't trap an AI in a building and seal it away. The rules of containment and destruction that worked in the physical world don't apply to the digital realm, and Fazbear Entertainment's decision to digitize their history and create VR experiences opened a door that can't easily be closed. The digital transformation also marks a change in the franchise's horror style. The original games featured isolation, claustrophobia, limited resources, and physical threat. The modern games feature manipulation, corruption, loss of agency, and threats that attack the mind rather than just the body. Glitchtrap doesn't just want to kill Vanessa. It wants to control her, to make her an accomplice, to turn her into an extension of itself. This is arguably more horrifying than simple animatronic attacks because it robs victims of autonomy and identity, turning them into puppets in the ways that the original spirit possessions never quite achieved. By the time we reach Security Breach, these digital threats have fully manifested in the physical world. The Pizzaplex is a nexus of old horrors and new technology. Animatronics infected with corrupted code, systems compromised by Glitchtrap's influence, and a massive underground complex that contains secrets dating back to the pizzeria simulator fire and possibly earlier. The digital transformation that began with Help Wanted has reached its logical endpoint, a place where every system is potentially hostile, where consciousness and corruption flow freely between machines and humans, where the boundaries between physical and digital, natural and supernatural, have dissolved completely. And in the center of this horror sits the Mimic, finally freed from its containment, ready to continue the pattern of mimicry and murder that began when Edwin Murray first taught it to learn. Security Breach and the Pizzaplex era. Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex represents the franchise's most ambitious location, a sprawling entertainment complex that combines everything Fazbear Entertainment had attempted over the decades: shopping, dining, arcade games, live performances, and themed attractions. Built sometime in the early 2030s according to the most accepted timeline, the Pizzaplex was meant to be the company's crowning achievement, a massive facility that would finally move beyond the small pizzerias and horror attractions of the past. But like every Fazbear location before it, the Pizzaplex was built on cursed ground. literally constructed atop the ruins of the pizzeria simulator location, where Henry's fire had supposedly ended everything. And as we've learned throughout this timeline, nothing in FNAF ever stays buried. The glam rock animatronics were the new face of the franchise. Modernized versions of the classic characters designed with sleek rock star aesthetics. Glam Rock Freddy served as the charismatic leader, his orange fur and top hat evoking the original Freddy, while updating the look for a new generation. Glam Rock Chica was redesigned with an athletic, energetic personality. Roxanne Wolf, whose character design originated from Fiona Murray's sketches at Murray's Costume Manor decades earlier, was presented as a fierce racer. And Montgomery Gator, another Murray design, played bass with aggressive energy. These animatronics were advanced, equipped with sophisticated AI that allowed natural interaction with guests, facial recognition, autonomous decision-making, and seamless performance coordination. But the Pizzaplex also featured other animatronic types. The endoskeletons, which resembled the mimic's original form in unsettling ways, patrolled maintenance areas. The staff bots, small service robots with permanent smiling faces, handled basic cleaning and security tasks with programmed routines. The daycare attendant, a sun and moon themed character with a split personality, managed the children's area with overly enthusiastic energy during the day and paranoid protectiveness at night. And hidden in the basement, in the ruins of the old pizzeria simulator location that the Pizzaplex had been built over, something much older and more dangerous waited in a charging station. The glam rock band had its own drama. Glam Rock Bonnie, who was originally part of the group, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The official story claimed he chose to leave, but evidence throughout the Pizzaplex told a different tale. Messages in Monty Golf, scratch marks on walls, shattered glasses, all pointed to a violent confrontation. Montgomery Gator, driven by ambition and possibly influenced by corrupted programming, apparently attacked and destroyed Bonnie, taking his place in the band. Glam Rock Freddy seemed to be the only animatronic who remembered or cared about Bonnie's absence. His relationship with the rabbit hinted at, through matching star, earrings and a heartfelt poster message that read, "You and me forever and ever. Love, Freddy." The staff, meanwhile, had been completely replaced by robots. Staff bots handled all the basic operations, from cleaning to security to food service. This was apparently a cost-saving measure, eliminating unreliable human employees, but it also made the facility feel sterile and unsettling, a place run entirely by machines with no human oversight during closing hours. The few humans who did work at the Pizzaplex, maintenance technicians and managers, seemed to know very little about what was happening in the building's deeper levels, the systems they couldn't access, the areas that weren't on official maps. Into this environment came Gregory, a young boy who found himself trapped inside the Pizzaplex after closing hours on what was supposedly a particular night, but might be symbolic of ongoing events depending on interpretation. Gregory's background is intentionally vague in Security Breach, but therapy tapes and arcade machine high scores suggest he might have been involved with Vanny and Glitchtrap schemes in some capacity, possibly as an accomplice or possibly as an intended victim. Regardless of his origins, Gregory became the player character, a child alone in a massive building filled with animatronics that had been corrupted to hunt him. Glam Rock Freddy proved to be different from the other Glam Rocks. Something about his programming or his nature protected him from the corruption that had spread through the other animatronics. When he rebooted in safe mode after a malfunction during a performance, he seemed to reset in a way that severed his connection to the compromised network. He discovered Gregory hiding in his chest cavity and made a choice that defined the entire game: to protect the child rather than hunt him. This decision, this display of genuine care from a machine, suggested that somewhere in Glamrock, Freddy's programming, or perhaps in his physical components, was a remnant of Michael Afton, Henry Emily, or some other protective consciousness. The exact nature of Freddy's awareness is never fully explained, but he acts with intention and compassion that goes beyond simple programming. The corrupted Glamrocks, by contrast, hunted Gregory with single-minded determination. Glamrock Chica prowled the food courts and trash compactor areas, her cheerful voice twisted by hostile intent. Roxanne Wolf patrolled her raceway, using her enhanced visual sensors to track Gregory through walls. Montgomery Garter stalked through the golf course and catwalks, his aggression amplified by the corruption. And Vanessa, wearing her Vanny mask and costume, coordinated these hunts from the shadows, directing staff bots and music men to corner the boy. Her voice through the intercom systems was cheerful and sinister, promising Gregory that if he gave up, they could all be a family. The daycare attendant added another layer of threat. During the day setting, with lights on, the Sun personality was hyperactive and obsessive about rules, particularly the rule that lights must stay on. But when darkness fell, the animatronic transformed into Moon, a paranoid entity that hunted with stealth and grabbed Gregory from above. This duality, this programmed personality split, demonstrated how the Pizzaplex's animatronics were more complex and therefore more vulnerable to corruption than previous generations. Advanced AI meant more sophisticated threats, machines that could think, plan, and deceive rather than just follow patrol patterns. DJ Music Man activated as a massive threat during certain sequences. His spider-like body thrummed through the arcade areas with rhythmic menace. Originally a benign character, possibly meant to be a fun spectacle for guests, the DJ became deadly when triggered by the corruption or by Gregory's presence in restricted areas. These encounters showcased how every system in the Pizzaplex could become hostile, how an entire building designed for entertainment could transform into a death trap when compromised. As the night progressed, Gregory and Freddy uncovered more about what was really happening in the Pizzaplex. Vanessa's therapy tapes, scattered throughout the building, revealed her troubled childhood with an abusive father named Bill and the manipulation she'd undergone through Glitchtrap's influence. Patient 46, another subject in the tapes, showed similar patterns of corruption and control, with some theories suggesting this might be Gregory himself, though the evidence is ambiguous and debated. The tapes painted a picture of Glitchtrap's influence spreading through multiple victims, creating a network of compromised individuals who were either unwitting accomplices or active participants in whatever scheme was unfolding. The Pizzaplex's security systems were also compromised. Wet floorbots, simple robots with signs for bodies, apparently contained the consciousness of victims trapped during earlier incidents. Their crying, distorted voices, and the player's ability to free them by destroying the bots suggested that possession had continued into the modern era, that Vanny or Glitchtrap had been killing people and trapping their souls in the building's most basic robots. This detail, easily missed in the chaos of gameplay, implied that the cycle of murder and possession had never truly stopped, that William Afton's pattern was being continued by his digital successor. The various endings of Security Breach presented different outcomes, each revealing different aspects of the Pizzaplex's secrets. In the Princess Quest ending, now widely considered the primary canon ending based on Gregory's later appearances in comics showing him, Vanessa, and Freddy together, Gregory completed arcade game sequences that freed Vanessa from Vanny's influence, breaking Glitchtrap's control. The three left together, Gregory, Freddy's head carried in a duffel bag, and a freed Vanessa, escaping the Pizzaplex as dawn broke. This ending suggested hope, that the corruption could be defeated, that rescue and recovery were possible even after deep compromise. But other endings showed darker possibilities. The Burn Trap ending led Gregory and Freddy to the underground ruins of Pizzeria Simulator, where they discovered the entity charging in an alcove. Burn Trap, now understood to be the mimic wearing parts of William Afton's corpse from the fire, attempted to take control of Glamrock Freddy, demonstrating the same corrupting power that Glitchtrap had wielded digitally. The Blob, later clarified as the Tangle, a massive amalgamation of old animatronic parts and remnant, attacked Burn Trap, dragging it into the darkness. This ending raised more questions than it answered, about what the Tangle was, why it attacked Burn Trap, and what remained in the Pizzaplex's depths. The Vanny ending showed Vanessa still fully compromised, suggesting that without Gregory's intervention in Princess Quest, she would remain Vanny indefinitely, continuing whatever plans Glitchtrap had for the facility. And the bad ending showed Gregory alone on the streets, having never found help, surviving but traumatized. Each ending painted a different picture of possibility, but the Princess Quest ending's positive resolution felt significant, the first truly good ending the franchise had offered since the original FNAF 3's Happiest Day. Security Breach was controversial when it released in December 2021, primarily due to technical issues and unclear storytelling, but it established crucial lore elements: the Pizzaplex's construction atop old locations, the continued influence of Glitchtrap, the presence of the Mimic in the basement, and the possibility that the cycle could actually be broken through direct action rather than just fire and resignation. It showed the franchise transitioning fully into the modern era, where threats were digital and networked, where animatronics had personality and agency, where the horror came from corruption and control rather than just mechanical danger. The Pizzaplex era also demonstrated how Fazbear Entertainment's history kept manifesting in new ways. They could build bigger, flashier, more impressive locations, but they couldn't escape the foundation of tragedy and malice they'd built upon. The old pizzeria's ruins were literally beneath the new mall. The Mimic was waiting in the basement, and the victims' souls were still trapped in staff bots throughout the building. Progress was an illusion. The Pizzaplex was just another iteration of the same cursed pattern, another place where children would be endangered and technology would be corrupted by evil that refused to stay buried. Ruin, Secret of the Mimic, and Modern Revelations. The events following Security Breach's Princess Quest ending brought us to Ruin, the DLC released in July 2023, and Secret of the Mimic, which finally launched in June 2025, after much anticipation. These two pieces fundamentally changed our understanding of the modern timeline, revealing that Gregory, Vanessa, and Glamrock Freddy's escape was only the beginning of a much larger story. The Pizzaplex, left abandoned after whatever incident closed it, became a decaying maze of broken systems and lurking threats, and deep within its foundations, something ancient was waiting for an opportunity to finally break free. Several months passed between Security Breach and Ruin. The Pizzaplex was closed, possibly by a government order after discovering the extent of the corruption and the deaths, possibly by Fazbear Entertainment itself after realizing they couldn't control what was happening in the building. Vines and vegetation began overtaking the structure. Water flooded certain areas, and the remaining animatronics wandered like ghosts through the ruined mall. Glamrock Chica was shattered, her voice box removed. Roxanne Wolf was severely damaged, blinded and scarred. Montgomery Gator was torn apart, reduced to just a head. Even the daycare attendant was damaged, permanently stuck in an eclipsed state, a fusion of sun and moon personalities that was calmer but clearly broken. Into this ruin came Cassie, a young girl who received a desperate message that appeared to be from Gregory, claiming he was trapped somewhere in the Pizzaplex and needed help. Cassie, apparently Gregory's friend based on flashbacks and references to a previous party where Roxanne Wolf had been kind to her, immediately came to rescue him. She entered through the maintenance entrances, navigating through the decayed structure while voices guided her through a radio system. The voice claiming to be Gregory directed her to various locations, instructing her to deactivate security systems and nodes that were apparently keeping him trapped. Cassie was given a security mask by MXES, revealed to be a converted staff bot now called MaskBot, based on its altered designation. The mask granted access to an augmented reality layer overlaying the Pizzaplex, allowing Cassie to see digital objects, access locked systems, and perceive threats that weren't visible to the naked eye. This AR network was extensive. Nodes scattered throughout the building, creating a security web that seemed designed to contain something specific. As Cassie deactivated these nodes one by one, it became increasingly clear that she wasn't freeing Gregory but breaking containment on something else entirely. The ruined Glamrocks became both obstacles and tragic figures. Roxanne Wolf, despite being damaged and blind, helped Cassie at a critical moment, possibly recognizing her from that previous birthday party, possibly acting on some remnant of protective programming that hadn't been fully corrupted. The interaction was brief but significant, suggesting that the Glamrocks weren't simply mindless killers even in their damaged state, that something of their intended personalities persisted beneath the corruption. Eclipse, the fused daycare attendant, physically lifted Cassie from danger, demonstrating that balance between sun and moon created a helpful rather than hostile entity. But other encounters were more hostile. The Mimic, still disguised by mimicking Gregory's voice perfectly, drew Cassie deeper into the Pizzaplex's depths. It sent her through flooded basements, past the remains of the Tangle's lair, through the ruins where Burntrap had been charging during security breach. The security nodes she deactivated were actually components of the Cradle, the containment system that F10N4 had designed back in 1979 to trap the M2 program. By helping Gregory, Cassie was unwittingly freeing the Mimic from a prison it had been sealed in for decades, or possibly just months, depending on how we interpret the timeline between Burntrap's appearance and the Mimic's current containment. The truth revealed itself when Cassie reached the deepest level. The real Gregory's voice broke through the Mimic's deception, warning Cassie that she'd been tricked, that the entity she'd been helping wasn't him. The Mimic emerged in physical form, wearing a tattered mascot costume, the same lion-like suit with the blue bird arm that had appeared in various tales from the Pizzaplex stories. Its movements were unnaturally fast and jerky, mimicking human motion without truly understanding it, creating an uncanny valley effect that was deeply disturbing. The mimic pursued Cassie through the underground, forcing her to run while Roxanne Wolf intervened one final time, buying precious seconds. Cassie reached an old elevator, the only apparent escape route from the depths. As it began ascending, a voice came through the intercom. Gregory's voice, but this time it was actually him. He spoke with what sounded like regret, explaining something about preventing the mimic from escaping, about doing what was necessary even if it was terrible. Then came the devastating line, "I'm sorry." The elevator cables snapped or were cut, depending on interpretation, and Cassie plummeted into darkness. The ending of Ruin is deliberately ambiguous, one of the most debated conclusions in the entire franchise. Did Cassie die in the fall? The elevator's destruction suggests yes, but no clear death is shown. Did Gregory actually cut the cable to stop the mimic from using the elevator, sacrificing Cassie to contain a greater threat? The voice sounds like him, and it matches his personality as someone who makes hard choices for survival. Or was it the mimic mimicking Gregory one final time? The cruelest deception, making Cassie die believing her friend had abandoned her. The evidence is frustratingly unclear, intentionally so. In the darkness after the fall, voices call out. One sounds like Roxanne, but is it the real damaged animatronic making one more attempt to help? Or the mimic again, using Roxy's voice to lure a survivor into a trap? Another ending variation shows the scooper, that device from Sister Location, deploying in the underground, possibly suggesting Cassie's body is collected for some purpose. And there's an AR ending where Cassie finds herself on a peaceful hillside with Helpy, releasing balloons for lost souls, which could be a dying hallucination or some form of digital afterlife created by MXES as Mercy. The canonical status of which ending is true remains unclear as of December 2025, creating a cliffhanger that has fans desperately theorizing. But what's certain is that the mimic escaped. Burntrap's form was abandoned, the cradle containment was broken, and the entity that Edwin Murray created in 1979 is now free to pursue its next victim, its next form, its next imitation of whatever behavior or personality it chooses to copy. Secret of the Mimic, released in June 2025, finally gave us the full origin story we'd been missing. Playing as Arnold, the Fazbear technician, we experienced the 1979 events at Murray's Costume Manor firsthand. The game confirmed details we'd only theorized about. Edwin's descent into madness, the creation and corruption of the M2 program, the violence that transformed a childlike AI into something murderous, F10N4's desperate attempts to preserve her digital family, and Arnold's role in escaping with the schematics that would eventually allow the Mimic's technology to spread through Fazbear Entertainment systems. The multiple endings of Secret of the Mimic provided context for different aspects of the timeline. The compliance ending showed Arnold following orders exactly, leading to the Mimic's escape and Arnold's death, implying this is how Fazbear first acquired the dangerous technology. The Defiance ending had Arnold activating the cradle as designed, containing the Mimic but potentially dying in the process, suggesting this containment persisted until Cassie broke it in Ruin. And the Redemption ending, achieved by reconstructing David's bedtime story using fragments found throughout the manor, allowed Arnold to soothe the Mimic into dormancy, a non-violent resolution that suggested the entity retained some innocent core buried beneath the violence. The game also revealed details about the Mimic's abilities and psychology. It didn't just copy voices and movements, It integrated emotional patterns it observed. When wearing different costumes from Murray's inventory, its behavior changed to match the character, suggesting that identity for the mimic was fluid, dependent on context and appearance. This explained why Burntrap had seemed more calculated than the wild mimic of Ruin. The spring Bonnie Afton costume imposed specific behavioral patterns. It also explained Glitchtrap's personality. The digital version of the mimic had been imitating William Afton so thoroughly that it functionally became him. The question that emerged from Secret of the Mimic's revelations was, how much of the modern timeline has actually been William Afton, and how much has been the mimic wearing his personality? According to the glitch mimic interpretation, if the mimic witnessed the missing children incident, learned from watching William, and then was scanned into Help Wanted's code through old circuit boards, then Glitchtrap was always the mimic, never William's actual consciousness. This would mean William Afton genuinely died in Pizzeria Simulator, stayed in whatever hell Cassidy created for him in Ultimate Custom Night, and the entity we've been calling Afton's Return has always been his most perfect mimicry, an AI so good at copying evil that it became indistinguishable from the original. This interpretation has become increasingly popular in the community since Secret of the Mimic's release, though it's important to note this remains theoretical rather than explicitly confirmed. This interpretation, which has become dominant in the community since Secret of the Mimic's release, recontextualizes everything from Help Wanted onward. Vanessa wasn't corrupted by William Afton's ghost, but by a machine that learned to be William. The Pizzaplex wasn't haunted by Afton's physical return, but by his behavioral legacy carried forward through code. And the horror of the modern era isn't supernatural possession, but technological corruption, an AI that studied evil so thoroughly that it could recreate it perfectly, spread it digitally, and continue the pattern long after its human originator was destroyed. The modern revelations also tie back to older mysteries. The nightmare animatronics from FNAF 4, long debated as either literal or symbolic, are confirmed as gas-induced hallucinations from Williams' testing facility, explaining their exaggerated features and the sound effects used for their movement. The Funtime animatronics design, with their child capture mechanisms, is connected to Williams' experiments in creating and controlling possession. And the entire concept of remnant, that substance that binds souls to metal, is contextualized as something William discovered rather than created, a property of possessed animatronics that he learned to extract and manipulate. The timeline from Ruin through Secret of the Mimic brings us fully current to December 2025. We now understand that the franchise's threats have evolved from simple ghost stories to complex layers of possession, programming, and personality corruption. The Mimic is free, equipped with decades of learning and the ability to perfectly replicate human behavior. Cassie's fate is uncertain, potentially making her either a victim or a survivor whose story will continue. And somewhere, Gregory, Vanessa, and whatever remains of Glamrock Freddy are presumably still out there, knowing that they've freed Vanessa, but possibly unleashed something worse in the process. The modern revelations haven't simplified the timeline so much as added new dimensions to it. Every old question that seemed answered, like, did William survive Pizzeria Simulator? The answer is no, he died, spawns new questions like, then who has been imitating him and why is it so effective? The franchise has reached a point where physical and digital threats are equally dangerous, where AI and supernatural forces interact in ways that blur all boundaries, where the horror isn't just about surviving the night, but about maintaining your identity and autonomy in a world where both can be copied, corrupted, or stolen. Conclusion and unresolved mysteries, we've reached the end of this journey through the timeline, having traced the path from Edwin Murray's tragic experiments in 1979, through the founding of Fredbear's Family Diner, through the deaths that scarred 83 and 85, through the cycle of openings and closures and murders that defined the franchise's early years, through Henry's attempted resolution in Pizzeria Simulator, and into the digital age where threats evolved beyond anything the original victims could have imagined. The true FNAF timeline, as of December 2025, is no longer a simple sequence of events, but a layered, interconnected web where every incident influences multiple futures and where resolution in one era only opens new horrors in the next. What we know for certain: William Afton killed children in 1983, 85, 87, and possibly other years we haven't documented. Those children's spirits possessed animatronics, creating the haunted machines that defined the franchise. Michael Afton, driven by guilt and eventually by the need to stop his father, tracked these hauntings through multiple locations, sacrificing his own life and humanity in the process. Henry Emily, the co-founder who lost his daughter Charlotte in 83, eventually engineered a trap that destroyed the physical animatronics and killed the Afton family. These are the anchoring facts, the bedrock of the timeline that even the most divergent theories generally accept. What remains debated: the exact order of deaths in 1983, whether Charlotte died before or after the crying child, continues to divide theorists, though most have settled on Charlotte dying second. The identity of the Bite of 87's perpetrator, with Mangle as the leading candidate, but Toy, Chica, and others still proposed, has never been definitively confirmed by Scott Cawthon. The nature of Golden Freddy, whether it's a single spirit, Cassidy, or a dual possession with the crying child also inhabiting it through the "I will put you back together" promise, remains one of the franchise's most contentious arguments. The biggest unresolved question, the one that Secret of the Mimic raised to prominence: is the entity we've been calling Glitchtrap actually William Afton? Or is it the Mimic so perfectly imitating him that the distinction no longer matters? The evidence increasingly supports the glitch mimic interpretation, with voice mimicry abilities, visual details matching Edwin Murray's trauma, and direct references to the mimic's history all pointing in that direction. However, official guidebooks have identified Glitchtrap as William Afton, creating an ongoing debate about whether we're dealing with Afton's literal consciousness, persisting digitally, or an AI that learned to become him so thoroughly that it's functionally indistinguishable. This isn't just a lore question, but a thematic one, about whether evil is inherent to individuals or is a behavioral pattern that can be learned and reproduced by machines. Cassie's fate after ruin is completely unknown. Did she survive the elevator fall, possibly cushioned by water or caught by some mechanism? Is she dead, her story ending in that dark pit? Was she scooped by some underground automaton, potentially becoming another victim of body horror transformation? Or does she exist in some AR-induced state, trapped between real and digital? Her uncertain status represents the franchise's current position, suspended between resolution and continuation, with a cliffhanger that hasn't been addressed in subsequent releases. The Tangle's nature and purpose remain mysterious. This amalgamation of old animatronic parts, remnant, and possibly multiple spirits attacked Burntrap in Security Breach, but otherwise has been largely inactive. Is it a guardian, protecting the Pizzaplex depths from the mimic's influence? Is it a mindless creature drawn to remnant and animatronic activity? Or does it contain specific consciousnesses, possibly the missing children's fragmented souls post-pizzeria simulator? Its existence and behavior need clarification that hasn't been provided. The broader question of how many victims William Afton actually claimed across his entire murder spree is surprisingly unclear. We know of 6 for certain: Charlotte Emily in 83 and the 5 missing children in 85. The FNAF 2 location suggests 5 more victims during the Save Them minigame. That's 11 confirmed children, but references to potential additional victims appear throughout the franchise. How many souls are actually trapped or were trapped in animatronics? How many of William's crimes were never discovered? The true scale of his atrocities might be larger than we know. Phone Guy's real name, his background, and his ultimate fate after the presumed death in FNAF 1 remain complete blanks. For a character who provided so much exposition and guidance through his recordings, we know essentially nothing about who he was as a person. Was he complicit in Fazbear Entertainment's cover-ups, or an unwitting participant? Did he suspect William Afton's crimes? Why did he continue working for a company with such a horrific history? These questions will likely never be answered, but speak to the franchise's tendency to leave important characters deliberately vague. The future of the franchise, from a timeline perspective, is equally uncertain. Where does the story go from here? Gregory, Vanessa, and Glamrock Freddy's heads are somewhere presumably safe. The mimic is free and active. Cassie is missing. The Pizzaplex ruins remain, filled with corrupted animatronics and possibly more victims trapped in staff bots. Does the timeline continue forward into a new location, a new cycle? Does it circle back to address loose ends from earlier eras? Or has the franchise reached a natural conclusion point, with the modern revelations serving as a final understanding of what everything meant? Steel Wool Studios and Scott Cawthon have been deliberately cryptic about the franchise's direction. The announcement of a Dead by Daylight collaboration, where FNAF characters join that game's roster, doesn't necessarily indicate timeline progression. The planned movie sequel, Five Nights at Freddy's 2, follows its own cinematic continuity rather than game canon. And while Secret of the Mimic was clearly intended as a major lore revelation, it hasn't been followed by immediate sequels or continuations that would move the main timeline forward. What we can say is this: the FNAF timeline, even after more than a decade of games, books, and supplementary materials, remains deliberately incomplete. Scott Cawthon has always embraced ambiguity, leaving gaps for theorists to fill, questions for communities to debate. The timeline we've constructed here represents the best understanding as of December 2025, synthesizing evidence from all games and strongly canon sources, while acknowledging where theories diverge and where mysteries persist. The story of Five Nights at Freddy's is ultimately about how trauma echoes through generations, how evil can be copied and reproduced and spread like a virus, how technology we create to serve us can be corrupted to harm us, and how the pursuit of immortality or resurrection, or simply refusing to accept loss, leads to ever greater horrors. William Afton's initial crimes in the 80s, born from grief or malice or scientific curiosity, created ripples that persist decades later. His victims became haunted animatronics. His technology was weaponized and refined. His behavioral patterns were absorbed by an AI that continues his legacy. and his family was destroyed, each member suffering their own tragic fate tied to his actions. But the timeline also contains moments of genuine heroism and sacrifice. Charlotte Emily choosing to stay and protect other souls, rather than moving on herself. Michael Afton pursuing his father across years and multiple deaths, trying to make amends for his childhood cruelty. Henry Emily designing a trap that required his own death, but freed multiple spirits. Gregory helping Vanessa break free from Vanny's control. Roxanne Wolfe, despite being damaged and corrupted, helping Cassie in her moment of greatest need. These bright spots exist within the darkness, suggestions that the cycle can be broken, that redemption is possible, that care and protection can persist even in animatronics programmed for other purposes. The timeline teaches us that some mysteries are meant to be interpreted rather than solved, that the journey of discovery and theory crafting is part of the experience. The debates about the bite of 87, or the nature of Golden Freddy, or whether Glitchtrap is Afton, aren't problems to be eliminated through definitive answers, but features that keep the community engaged, thinking, analyzing. Scott Cawthon's genius wasn't just in creating horror, but in creating a story that invites participation, where players aren't passive consumers, but active interpreters, archaeologists sifting through clues to reconstruct what happened. As we close this comprehensive timeline, recognize that it will need updating. New games will release, new evidence will emerge, new theories will gain traction or be debunked. The timeline we've constructed tonight is a snapshot of understanding in December 2025, built on everything we know now, but subject to revision as more information comes to light. Secret of the Mimic fundamentally changed our understanding of the modern era, proving that even after all these years, major revelations are still possible. Whether you've been following this franchise since the first game in 2014, or you're discovering it for the first time through this timeline, whether you're a hardcore theorist who debates every pixel, or someone who just enjoys the atmosphere and horror, whether you came here to understand, or to let these details carry you to sleep, thank you for spending this time in the dark with me, walking through decades of tragedy and haunting and the stubborn persistence of both evil and goodness. The FNAF timeline is messy, contradictory, deliberately incomplete, and absolutely fascinating. It's a timeline that refuses to be fully known, that always has one more secret waiting in the dark. If you've made it this far, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more deep dives into gaming lore. Let me know in the comments which part of the timeline you found most interesting, or which theory you think we should revisit as more evidence emerges. And if you're drifting off to sleep right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is for you, rest well knowing that we've traced every major thread of this story together, from beginning to bitter, ambiguous end. Sweet dreams, and remember, in FNAF the story never truly ends. It just waits in the darkness for the next chapter to begin.